Welcome once again to Washington and Me. I'm your host, George Blaze. The summer of 2020 continues. One like certainly we've never seen before, certainly not in my adult life. The energy continues, the momentum continues. We're at a pivotal point now in American history for effective policy change that affects the lives of Black people and other minorities in this country in many different ways. This summer's unrest started with, of course, protests against the death of an unarmed Black man, George Floyd, and has gone on to build momentum to really see if this is the moment where some real change can happen. And joining me to talk about what's been going on in the Seattle area and abroad is Tarika Powell from Seattle Black Collective Voice. Tarika, it's such a pleasure to talk to you today.
It's nice to talk to you also, George. Thanks for inviting me on the program.
Well, let's do a little bit of background here. Let's talk about how Seattle Black Collective Voice came together, the circumstances that brought it together.
Seattle Black Collective Voice came together in the protest area known as, first as the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or CHAZ, then the Capitol Hill Organized Protest, or CHOP. It was a protest that grew out of several weeks of police violence on protesters in Seattle that started at the end of May. And it included protesters being hit with so-called non-lethal crowd suppression devices, chemical weapons such as tear gas, police shooting flashbangs at us regularly. The Capitol Hill neighborhood where we were protesting at what was called the Western Barricade near the Eastern Precinct. We were there for almost 2 weeks, basically at squaring off against the police at a barricade, and we were repeatedly tear gassed and again shot with other non-lethal weapons. It's a very densely populated neighborhood, and so that meant that the entire neighborhood was also tear gassed in their homes. And eventually the police abandoned that precinct. And once they abandoned that precinct, protesters went in and set up this positive community space where we had art, where we had anti-racist education, conversational centers. We put on citizens forums every day, talking about envisioning our future, the future of policing in America.
As things progressed, of course, particularly if you weren't in the Seattle area and you're watching on the national news media, a different picture was painted of the whole situation from when you actually talk to people who are on the ground there. If you judge from other cities watching from the outside, it seemed that it was chaos, armed bands of armed men walking around at night harassing people. But that's not necessarily the truth, is what I'm getting.
It isn't, George, and a lot of, unfortunately, in the situation of the Capitol Hill organized protest, some things that were put out there by the media and by right-wing sources became a self-fulfilling prophecy. It was originally a very peaceful space. There were thousands of Seattleites that walked through there unharmed every single day. And at the same time that I was down there in that space giving speeches or, getting free food, getting free masks, getting free COVID tests, I'm seeing on some of these media outlets that it is this lawless place. But there were a couple of things that happened. Number one was the police put out some stories that later turned out to not be true. They were putting out stories such as saying that we, the protesters, were extorting residents and businesses in the area. And that's one example of many things that were claimed by the police where it was later revealed they had no evidence or they were just simply going off rumors. There were no actual police reports filed to substantiate what they were saying. But we also, because this became such a hot button issue in the media and it was just so breathlessly reported on, we also became a target of right-wing extremist groups. And there were threats that were made online and they were credible threats. And so some people, some gun rights advocates here came down to the area to protect us from those threats. And so then you saw people taking pictures of them and posting those pictures and spreading it like they're down there, patrolling the borders with armed weapons, not letting anyone in. But the reason that they came there was because there were threats by others to come and harm us. And so there was a lot of misinformation that went on. And it was really a very interesting media cycle to be a part of, because you're aware, we're all aware on some level of the degree to which we have misinformation in a lot of media outlets, particularly, in my opinion, right-wing media outlets. But to actually be a part of a news cycle where you're standing here experiencing one thing and people are reporting something so drastically far from the truth, it was an interesting experience.
It seemed like one of the major challenges was, as organizers were putting together a platform, putting together a list of needs, of demands, of word moving policy would move forward, and these kind of discussions to happen. There wasn't a direct line of communication between legislators, the mayor's office, the police department, and the people who are actually gathering the thoughts in a cohesive way. They would talk to a random person who happened to be walking around shop, and that was their opinion of what was going on.
Yeah. So there was, as you alluded to, there was a lack of communication in the official channels between the mayor's office and between the police force. I am always trying to get people to understand that the police created CHOP in a number of ways. One of the ways that they did it was they barricaded us off of the area around the East Precinct. They claimed that they had a credible threat to the precinct, but the data that they were relying on was just a report that generally said that some police stations might be targeted after Minneapolis. That does not equal a credible threat. So they barricaded us off of that area, and they terrorized us there for a week and a half. And so psychologically, what you had was people, once they abandoned the precinct, people wanting to go into that space that we had been kept out of. It's this just interesting psychological phenomenon where it's like you were really harmed in this place, and people wanted to take that and create something positive out of it. And I believe, actually, I know that also on the first night and the first couple of nights, the first people who started camping in CHOP, they camped there to protect the police precinct. After the police abandoned it, it was unclear who gave the order. The chief of police has said she didn't give the order. The mayor has said she didn't give the order. And so people were like, why did they abandon the precinct then? And a lot of people felt like they're setting us up. They want us to do damage here so that it will retroactively justify what they've done to us. And so people camped out to prevent that from happening. They also camped out to prevent a fire from being set to the precinct, because like I said earlier, it's a densely populated residential area. If there's a fire at the precinct, it's going to spread to residential buildings. There were no protesters who were interested in having a fire at that precinct. And so their actions created CHOP from the perspective of creating this psychological need, and also from the perspective of negligently abandoning the space. So yeah, it was quite an experience, George. I didn't expect to find myself down there. I just went out into the streets and protested like I've been doing really for 5 years. And like you were saying, you know, there's the question of when does it turn into actual change? You know, it didn't turn into actual change after Mike Brown or Tamir Rice or Sandra Bland. And we've taken to the streets after all of these people. But this is the most violent police suppression of protests that I have experienced in 5 years of taking to the streets around this issue.
One of those areas that people find controversial in talking about what the plan is for reform or where we can move forward on this is the idea of defunding the police. I recently saw on Seattle Black Collective Voices Twitter feed, someone had put some numbers up there that showed that for the cost of what it takes to equip a single police officer to go and approach and to be in the riot situation, could pay for hundreds of kids' lunches. Like, these kind of numbers are not, it's not secret what we mean by reallocating resources. I wonder if you could share with me your thoughts on what defunding the police means to you.
Right. So what we have done in this country, you know, we used to have more serious conversations about what is the best approach to people who commit crimes. Is it a punitive approach? Is it an approach that reintegrates them into society and provides them different alternative opportunities? And unfortunately, we went down the path of deciding that our response to all crimes of every degree is going to be a punitive approach where we just lock them up, get them out of sight and out of mind. And there are politicians who have made their entire careers off of promising to do this, and then they had to deliver that once they got elected. And so we have gotten into a position where the police respond to every issue in society. The police respond to someone having a mental health crisis who is not committing a crime. The vast majority of things that police respond to and things that people call 911 for could be answered by someone other than the police. But because we have decided the police are what we're going to use to solve all of these problems, we've also allocated a tremendous amount of our city, state, and federal budgets to policing. And so defunding is about reallocating those monies to things that work, not using the police to respond to every situation. And one great example is mental health. People with untreated mental health issues are 16 times more likely to be killed by police than the general population. 1 in 4 of the people who are killed by police are someone who had a mental health issue. The police are not adequately trained to respond to people who have mental health issues, are not adequately trained to understand the ways in which they might act differently. And we're not just talking about people who may be acting violently. We're talking about people who just may not be responding typically. For example, I have PTSD. If I interact with the police, it's a stressful encounter for me. My affect is probably not going to be the affect that they are expecting. Sometimes I will notice that they are viewing me suspiciously because I'm not acting the way that they think a normal person would be acting. And a lot of times that leads to tragic outcomes for people who are nonviolent and who simply have mental health issues. And so in those instances, for example, we would want to not fund the police to respond to those calls. We would want to fund mental health professionals to respond to those calls.
It would seem to me, and I have law enforcement officers in my extended family and in my family as well, and amongst my circle of friends in certain places, they don't want to be doing this stuff. I think a lot of times we get in the mindset of thinking that all police officers are monolith and that every single one of them is. I think we have to just be careful about that sometimes, particularly when we're trying to find solutions.
That is a conversation, George, that is one of the conversations that people are having, right? I am aware that police also say we do not want to be responding to all of these calls, but they simultaneously also don't want to give up the money that they are getting to do so and to reinvest it in other places. And so I think that what I'm not seeing accountability for in officers in which you're able to have these genuine conversations with, you're not seeing a full accountability for the ways in which the police force has become oppressive to citizens, the ways in which citizens are treated as enemy combatants by police forces, and the ways in which the structures need to be overhauled. You're seeing so-called good police officers being pushed out of the force for doing the right thing and trying to hold other people accountable. And so I think that I would be more interested in that conversation if I was seeing more accountability for overhaul within the police system. But in the absence of that, then we have to pursue avenues outside of that system, such as defunding.
The other challenging aspect is that in the interest of intersectionality and inclusivity, you run the risk of the movement being infiltrated by outside groups and other groups who have completely different motives and goals in mind, that some of which are not constructive to what's trying to be done in terms of bringing justice. And it's important to address that as well.
Who are you thinking of in particular?
Once again, I've seen it in different cities, in Chicago and Philadelphia, also in Seattle, where you have a protest going and there are individuals mixed into the crowd who are causing problems that are easy for the police to react to and exacerbate a situation where the kind of dialogues you're trying to have about creating justice can't happen.
I think that as somebody who has been to a lot of protests, there's always a small percentage of people who are just there for the cover of the opportunity to break something or set a trash can on fire or something like that. And I've been to so many protests that were 99.99% peaceful and not causing up any damage, but the photographer that's there for a media outlet will zoom in on that trash can that somebody set on fire way on the edge of the protest. And so I think sometimes that sort of exacerbates or amplifies something that is not a large problem. In the protest that we had here in Seattle, there's a wide range of people involved in the protest. You have African Americans who are there largely for the principle of Black Lives Matter, and we need to hold the police accountable for disparate policing in Black communities, over policing in Black communities. When CHOP formed, you also had people who were anarchists, and they were acting based on anarchist principles. You have people in the protests who do identify as anti-fascist. You have people who identify for a wide variety of political leanings. But what I found is that we were all working towards the same issue. And really it's about government overreach. The government in this case depriving Black people of their life and their liberties. And so I don't see them as being separate, even if they had different strategies of achieving the goal of reducing that overreach. I don't see them as working towards a separate goal, and I do resist, the urge to feel that they're making us look bad, because I think that is not the conversation that I want to focus on. I want to focus on the conversation of changing the system instead of participating in a conversation that sort of diverts from what the ultimate goal is.
That's fair and honest. I can't disagree with you on that one. Things came to a very tragic crescendo in the CHOP zone with the death of Lorenzo Anderson. I had a chance to speak to some people who are close to that family as well. But there seems to have been a complete freeze out of information as to where the investigation has gone or what's going to happen from there. Do you have any insights you can share on what the situation is with that particular case?
I don't have any insights I can share on that case. It is something that I know is absolutely heartbreaking for everyone. And it is heartbreaking for the people who tried to save Lorenzo's life. It is frustrating for them as they were trying to call on help from fire department medics who were on the scene and who would not offer assistance. It was traumatizing. The shooting happened right outside the CHOP zone, and so there was a bit of frustration mixed in that the police immediately jumped on it to say this is something that happened in CHOP, is something connected to the protest. It was not connected to the protest. And I think that there was a bit of there's still a bit of trying to turn that family against and the protesters against each other and create this conflict, when it's my experience that we're all grieving that incident. I don't have any insider information. When the zone was still open and I was still going down there, there was a memorial for Lorenzo Anderson. And I took the same approach as a lot of people, that I did not want to disturb the family who would be there at the memorial each day. I would stop by, I would ask them if they need anything. But because of the salacious nature that the story has been covered, there has been this rift sort of put between the family and the protesters. And it was a loss, honestly, for all of us on that night.
Absolutely. It's a sad thing. My thoughts and prayers to the family and to everyone involved as well. It is a terrible thing to put that kind of a mark on what seems to be such a pivotal moment in history. And I think that's what's important about this time in history, is that I don't see the momentum slowing down. When I look at Portland, when I look at Chicago, this isn't just a flash in the pan where everything's going to calm down. People really want solutions. People really want change in a big way. And we're moving into perhaps the most tumultuous electoral cycle in our modern history in November. What's going to happen? What's going to move forward? What summer of 2020 have in store as far as you can see?
Well, I agree with you, and the late John Lewis, one of the things he said last month about these protests, and John Lewis was active in the civil rights protests. He got arrested 40 times, I believe, between 1960 and 1966. And having that firsthand experience, what he said about these protests that we're doing now is that it's different. There's so much more engagement from so many different types of people all over the country, in big cities, in small cities. And he said there will be no turning back from this moment. I believe that to be true as well. We're already making progress here in Seattle and in a lot of other cities, but in Seattle, we do have a pledge from a veto-proof pledge from 7 of our city council members to defund the police. The city council is looking at the police budget with more thorough detail than they ever have before. And so I think this will actually be a time where you see movement and where we finally do engage with that question of what are the best ways to handle different types of crimes. Right now, we have a one-size-fits-all approach. We just throw them all in jail and keep them away from everyone for a little while. There is no improvement for people within that system, and a lot of people come out of that system who went in as non-violent criminals can come out of that system as violent criminals, participating in crimes worse than what they originally were put into the system for. And so we are really, for the first time in a long time in this country, having an evaluative conversation of how we deal with people who have engaged in crimes. Why is it that people in this country who have committed nonviolent marijuana crimes are doing the same amount of time as people who have murdered someone? Why do we have a system that is punishing people in that way? And so we're having real conversations about restorative justice. We're having real conversations about transformative justice. Transformative justice is where you are investing in infrastructure and healthcare and education and other systems that are proven to prevent crime from happening. As I said earlier, the police are not very good at preventing crime. They respond to crime once it happens. There are programs that are proven effective at preventing crime. Our prison system has a high rate of recidivism, meaning that people just start to go in and out of the system. When you're working with restorative justice, you have decreases in recidivism, sometimes in the 80th percentile for some types of crimes. And so we're having a real conversation about what is actually the best way to go about this, because we have the highest prison population in the entire world, and it is quite obviously not actually fixing the problems.
I think one of the most important things that I was able to glean from the Seattle Black Collective Voice website is that it speaks to this idea of truth and reconciliation. One of the things that stopped South Africa from descending into a bloodbath in the 90s was this idea of, instead of just blaming and fighting, we want the white people to come forward and say how they contributed to apartheid systems so that we can better understand what role people played, how the system works to deconstruct it. And this is one of those things I think is most brilliant about what you're doing.
Yeah, and initially a lot of people in this country, when you hear about that, they're like, oh wait, so you didn't put them in jail, you didn't punish them, you just let them admit to what they did and walk off. But the people who were the victims said that it was very restorative for them. And so that sort of truth and reconciliation is often a part of restorative justice conversations if the victim of the crime wants to have that conversation. And it helps reduce rates of PTSD and anxiety that are associated with being the victim of a crime. It helps people more often feel like they are seen within the criminal justice system. because a lot of times in our system, even if a person is punished, the victim doesn't get to participate in the process very much. And so the victim doesn't necessarily get personal relief. Restorative justice is also about, making the victim whole. The criminal might have to pay the victim back. And so it is a more holistic form of dealing with crime in a way that sees the perpetrator as a human being, it sees the victim as a human being. It's not the answer to all situations, right? And one of the things we're still working on and looking at when we talk about alternatives to detention is that most people would agree that there are still instances where detention is appropriate. But these systems are still developing, and there are circumstances in which we know that they work extraordinarily well, and we can start applying them to those circumstances instead of locking people up in for-profit prisons.
Well, Tarika, I have about a minute left here. You mentioned holistic. It's very important during these times that we as a collective make sure that we do some self-care, particularly those of us who are leading on the front lines and doing the work and doing the journalism and being out here to cleanse and to clean and to purify and to make sure that we're strong enough to continue the job. What are some of the things you've been doing as far as self-care is concerned?
Yeah, like I said, I have PTSD, so I try to take very good care of my mental health. I do yoga, I do mindfulness meditation, and I go out in nature and take hikes. I love to be in the outdoors. And so actually later on today, once I get off the phone with you, I'm going to go to the park.
That sounds fantastic. Tarika Powell, Seattle Black Collective Voice, thank you so much for spending time with me today. And as we move through this summer, I know this isn't over with, so I hope you'll have some time and come back and we talk about where we're at in a couple of weeks.
I would love to. Thank you for having me, George.
Absolute pleasure. And thank you all for watching. We'll see you next week right here on Washington and Me.